All right, let's get a better understanding now of what is involved in trying to come to a decision when NERSA does take this decision. And we're joined by Newzroom Afrika's business reporter, Ntokozo Khumalo, who is hopefully going to explain this to us in layman's terms. Ntokozo, good morning to you. South Africans are obviously going to ask the question, what's the basis or justification for this tariff increase application by Eskom, when they've been asking for years as to where is the value for money for these increases, because we don't have reliable electricity supply?
Good morning, Xoli. That's indeed a very valid question for all South Africans, especially if we consider the fact that for the first 10 years of our democracy, actually, Eskom's average electricity fees were amongst the lowest in the world. But between 1994 and 1999, the yearly price increase never exceeded annual inflation rates, which meant that the real price of electricity was actually on the decline. However, after load shedding was first implemented in 2007, prices did start to skyrocket. And if we look at that load shedding over time, we can see that, from 1988, which is 2 years after I was born, to 2008, the electricity crisis, tariff increases have not kept up with inflation. Now, this was partly due, of course, to government policy to keep electricity tariffs as low as possible for vulnerable communities in South Africa, as well as Eskom actually having an oversupply of electricity. But remember, this was back in the 90s, Xoli, and in the early 2000s, this was mostly on the back of lack of investment in new capacity. So between 1988 and 2007, electricity tariffs have actually increased by a whopping 223%. And from 2007 to this year, we've seen an even higher jump with electricity tariffs quadrupling in real money terms over the last 14 years or so. So that is just kind of where we're standing right now when it comes to looking back at the increases we've seen over the years.
And that's very, very important background that you've laid there for us, Ntokozo. So based on what you have said, it would seem that all of these issues have actually lay at the door of Eskom, which then prompts the question, what has the utility been doing about it if this electricity crisis issue stems from as far back as you have mentioned?
Yeah, well, industry experts certainly put the issue squarely on Eskom, saying that they haven't actually done enough to ensure that, they up capacity and so on. So considering that the last increase granted to the national power utility was 9.6% for the year earlier this year, although it had applied for that 20.5% increase. Now, the utility says that the increases ensures that customers are aligned to the actual cost that they impose on the system. Now, if we remember that back in 2020, Eskom won a major court battle which allowed the utility to recoup billions in what it said was lost revenue through increased electricity tariffs, with the North Gauteng High Court finding that NERSA was wrong for not allowing Eskom to collect that 69 billion in unforeseen expenses. Since then, the power utility has been able to introduce those significant tariff increases over and above the previously approved hikes, which are coming over the next coming years. Now, NERSA has been trying to shift its methodologies in how it actually determines what Eskom can include in its tariff applications, but these have not been finalized, Xoli. So meanwhile, Eskom is also looking to overhaul its tariff structure to be more reflective of the costs that they experience and keep up pace with the changing energy landscape landscape. But until these matters are settled, Xoli, both NERSA and Eskom are really using aging infrastructure or aging systems, and with the argument that considers that the current serious state of Eskom's debt and the fact that the country probably cannot afford for Eskom to fail consumers can likely expect much more higher than inflation electricity price increases to continue over the next several years, unless there really is a shake-up to Eskom's monopoly of South Africa's power.
Yeah, and that then prompts the question about what are the drivers for the latest electricity tariff application?
Well, I think the one thing that the utility never runs out of is there's always factors as to why we keep seeing those electricity hikes. And this time it seems the Russia-Ukraine conflict is pretty up there as one of the primary drivers of, this new application. The assumption being that it will continue to make diesel more expensive. Earlier this year, we did hear Eskom's Chief Operating Officer, Jan Opelhose, explaining that 7.7 billion rand had already been spent on diesel in the year's first 6 months. Now, that is a figure that the utility had planned in its budget for the entire year. It was spent in 6 months, clearly. So the overspending, was justified by the utility CEO, Andre de Ruyter, as a means to an end. He said that relying on more diesel to avoid load shedding is what's driving up those costs.
Yeah, and then the other obvious question is the role that municipalities play in driving up these tariff increases. Are you able to explain that?
And I think, Dolly, for the average South African, that is something that we don't really think about much, on the role that municipalities do play in further increasing, those tariffs. They play a significant role in the distribution of electricity in South Africa, acting mostly as intermediaries. What this means is they buy the electricity from Eskom, resell it to businesses, to homes, and to other institutions. And we can just see, when we look at the picture of municipality and how much electricity they've bought, the largest Eskom tariff increase there was recorded in the 2010-2011 financial year, and that was a 28.9% jump, while municipalities recorded an average increase of 30.5% in electricity purchases for that year. So, we see the rise from the utility itself, and then it's also passed on to consumers by municipalities. And in 2017-2018, there was a decrease in electricity purchases, with Eskom's rates increasing by a nominal 0.3% that year. And municipalities tend to generate more revenue when there is an increase in Eskom's tariff. And that indicates that municipalities raise their own tariffs as well and passes some of this cost to consumers. But it is also notable that the growth in electricity sales is lower than the growth of those Eskom rates. But it's also important to keep in mind, Boli, that municipalities are different. In the 2020-21 financial year, South African municipalities spent 95.1 billion rand to purchase electricity from Eskom, and obviously sold their power off to their own consumers, generating 118.1 billion rand in revenue. Now, the gap between these two represents a surplus of 23 billion rand, much needed funding that is often used to finance other municipal activities.
Yeah.
And then if we just take a look at also the revenue, I see they've pulled up the graph, and it shows us that, electricity sales as a percentage of total revenue for each local and metropolitan municipality, and for every rand of revenue generated in those markets that we see, 57 cents was from electricity sales. So when we cross over to KwaDukuza in KwaZulu-Natal, which is another municipality that relies heavily and heavily dependent on sales of electricity, with about 46% of its revenue generated from this source of cash, over at Chief Albert Lutulu local municipality, which is in Mpumalanga, and over in Limpopo, it records relatively low percentages, with both municipalities making about 3% of their total revenue being generated from the sale of electricity. Yeah. So these small contributions are not expected, as the vast majority of households in those two municipalities specifically source their electricity directly from Eskom, which means there's no, middleman required there.
Yeah. Well, it tells the story that municipalities also need to generate revenue in some way, shape or form. And so I suppose they can't be blamed for being intermediaries, as you've explained them to be. Final question, are there any alternatives to this power crisis? And I ask this as a desperate resident who wants to get out of load shedding as quickly as I can, but I suspect I'm going to have to wait like many other South Africans.
Yeah, you'd have to wait like the rest of us, Goli. And I think the alternatives that are there, the conversation that is being unpacked around those alternative energy solutions is the cost, is the price. Will it be any cheaper than what Eskom is currently offering us? Will it be any more sustainable than what we're experiencing, especially with those rolling, blackouts? But later on, I will be chatting to Solar Group, which is a vertically integrated provider of renewable energy solutions, and it's aiming to transform Africa through clean energy. Now, the group recently secured 400 million rand to build commercial and industrial solar PV facilities across Southern Africa. So we'll be speaking to, the CEO from Solar Group just to talk through us, that renewable energy fund that will enable 40 megawatts of solar PV projects to be built without capital expenditure by electricity off-takers, and will be located in cities such as Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Nelspruit, Polokwane, Durban and Cape Town. So we'll hear from them on what are those, possible electricity tariff hikes going to mean for consumers, and how do alternative energy solution providers like themselves help solve that problem. So we'll be chatting around 30. Our viewers can stick around for that conversation.
All right. And Ntokozo Khumalo, thank you very much for putting us in picture there. She is our business reporter here at Newzroom Afrika. All right.